Washington is a small, connected little world, and Sally and I are actually neighbors. I have also been a longtime fan. As one of our country's leading biographers, Sally has written extensively on the royal family with books on Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles and Princess Diana, as well as our own American royal family, John and Jacqueline Kennedy, and biographies of William S. Paley, Pamela Harriman, and Bill and Hillary Clinton. A CNN royal correspondent, her latest book, George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Saved the Monarchy, brings us to a pivot point in the history of Great Britain. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Sally Bedell Smith. This is such an amazing book, and I think when you see it really, this is a good day to curl up with it also. It is exhaustively researched and extensively, carefully kind of threaded through. And it's safe to say the world has been somewhat riveted by the royal family, with the tumult of Harry and Meghan and the coronation of Charles as king, a role he really has waited a lifetime for. And you covered this as a royal correspondent for CNN. What was that moment like?
Well, it was exhausting and exhilarating. I want to say one quick thing. First of all, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy Mary invited me, my neighbor, friend, and to see such a lovely turnout, including friends, some of whom I have not seen, at least one I have not seen in 60 years.
Wow.
So
wow,
that's pretty good.
Wow.
I love it when that happens. Others close to that. I want to say one thing, before I get to the coronation, I want to say one thing about this cover, which to me really says so much about these four. The king called them us four. And one of the friends of the future Queen Elizabeth II, who we'll call Lilibet today because she named herself that when she was 2 and also distinguished herself from her mother. But one of her friends said that her parents, or this group, were one sort of unified relationship who meant everything, who meant the world to each other and formed one spiritual whole without, independent of anyone on the outside, much less their relatives. And that one sentence really summed up the mutual devotion that they had to each other. Now, on to the coronation. It was, having written extensively in this book about the last coronation of a king and a queen, which occurred on May 12, 1937, I was fascinated, and I'd also written about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in my book about her, which was in 1953. I was really, really interested to see what the differences would be, because Charles has always sort of cast himself as a modernizer, but here was a ceremony of church and state that has been around for 1,000 years. So you can't really tinker with a lot of the basics. And I don't know how many of you watched it, but I found it completely riveting to see all what the late Queen used to call her kit. You know, the mace and the swords and all of that, the orb. And he didn't really mess around with that much, because he really couldn't. But he introduced women in roles they had never had. He introduced a child at the very beginning, and he said something that I think was so important. This 14-year-old chorister greeted him at the entrance of Westminster Abbey, and Charles said to him, "I come not to be served, but to serve." And there were lots of other things. He commissioned 12 pieces of music, which were really beautiful. He knows an enormous amount about music and always has been a patron of opera companies, of symphonies, you name it. And Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote a beautiful hymn at Charles's request that was played, that was sung during the anointing and crowning of Camilla. But the most wonderful thing he did occurred during the anointing, which is, as I was told by any number of Anglican clerics, that it was not so much the crowning that was the essential part of the coronation, but the anointing with the holy oil and making the solemn oath. And it had always been done in a very grand way by 4 Knights of the Garter holding silver poles with a gold canopy on top. And instead, Charles commissioned this 3-sided panel, or three connected panels, which emphasized the role of the British monarch as the head of the Commonwealth of 54 nations around the world. And he had each of them, and there was a dual symbolism in it. It was not only honoring the Commonwealth, which was really one of his mother's great legacies, keeping it together, making things happen through soft power, like in South Africa when things were going very, very badly wrong. But also, it was a tree. And a tree symbolized his commitment to the environment, his prescience about the environment, going all the way back to 1970. And it was also designed to make the anointing even more private than it had been. So on the one hand, he was he was opening up this ancient ceremony, but at the same time, with this tripart panel, he was also underlining one element of the mystery of the monarchy.
Well, this story actually, of course, then begins decades ago with what you posit is the marriage that saved the monarchy. What do you mean?
Well, George, the then Duke of York and Duchess of York, first of all, it's a fantastic love story. He pursued her for 30 months and took 3 times to get her to say yes. And I have a lot of wonderful details from the Royal Archives that describe the drama, the twist and the turn. But they became the Duke and Duchess of York. And they were sort of going about their business until January of 1936, when his father, King George V, died. It was euthanasia, but nobody said it at the time. They needed to make the deadline for the Times of London. Believe me, it happened.
Read the book.
It happened. He was injected with cocaine and morphine. But anyway, he died, and his eldest son, Edward VIII, became king. He was, and I had not known this before I wrote this book, he was a dreadful king, not only because he sympathized with the Nazis, and that would have been a disaster in World War II, but he was also irresponsible, self-centered, cynical, inattentive to even the most basic duties. The things that he did when he was king were mind-boggling. He was doing a lot of damage. But it was the arrival of Wallace Warfield Simpson, twice divorced, American from Baltimore, social climber. Well, I won't talk about that part. But anyway, she was bad news, but he was madly in love with her. And he decided that he had to marry her, and he wanted to make her his queen, which neither the church nor the government would permit. And so he, on December 10th, 1936, he signed an instrument of abdication, and the next day, when Parliament passed it, the Duke of York, known generally as Bertie, and his wife became king and queen. And he said to one of the advisors to his brother, he said, I don't know how I'm going to clean up this mess, but somehow I'm going to do my best. And they were rattled by what they unexpectedly were now going to have to do. But it was interesting that within a few days, she wrote to several of her friends, and she said, the curious thing is, we're not afraid. And they immediately sort of established a sense of, a sense of relief, a sense of contentment, because they were a family, they were a clearly devoted family, and they immediately went out and did their duty with the utmost diligence, and then they were soon to be extremely challenged. I mean, you probably all think of George VI when you think of the King's Speech and his really poignant struggle, lifelong, really, to overcome his stammer and his work with Lionel Logue, the speech therapist. And everybody thinks of Queen Elizabeth as the Queen Mum, which she was for 50 years after her husband died at age 51 and she was 50. But this is really a book that looks at their marriage over 28 years and their upbringing, and particularly his reign for 15 years, including the 6 years of World War II, which were harrowing. And so in the way they took charge, the way they behaved themselves, the way they inspired people, they saved the monarchy, particularly in World War II.
Which we'll get to in a little bit, but this book, which really you do fall into because you've done an extraordinary job at weaving this very densely textured tapestry, so much relying on this constant communication by letters.
Yes.
They are constantly writing to Queen Mary, the king's mother, constant communication. She writes to her mother. It's this thread of archival material which allowed you, there are times where biography really does illuminate huge truths. And
yes.
You've written this in really a grippingly narrative fashion that pulls you in. And it is because Queen Elizabeth herself granted you
yes.
this sort of rare, unprecedented access to the royal archives. Explain that.
I wish I'd known what was going through her mind, but I knew because having written about the Queen, having written about her son, and decades earlier, having written about Diana, but particularly since I'd written about the Queen and the future king, I wanted to do the origin story. I wanted to find out what preceded them and how each of them was shaped by their experience. So that was really the reason. And I knew that I couldn't really tell that story in an authentic way without having access to their papers. Now, my previous books, I had used sort of occasional archives that, here, there, in England and over here, but I knew that this was the key to the kingdom, as it were. And so I got in touch with two people, one of whom, Samantha Cohen, had worked for the Queen for 17 years and later had the misfortune to be assigned to be in charge of Harry and Meghan for a year, which I don't know, we won't talk about that. But anyway, back in 2018, I went to her because we'd established a really good relationship. I'd gotten to know her very well when I was writing the book about the Queen, and she was pleased with the book. She felt it was fair, she felt it was thorough, she felt it was deeply researched. And I said, would you help me? And she said yes. And so she and I worked together on a letter that I would write to the Queen asking for her permission. And there was one other person who, they both became my advocates, and the other person was William Shawcross, who wrote the official biography of Queen Elizabeth, and then he published a wonderful volume of her letters. And he said that he would deal with a private secretary who he knew very well. And it took about 6 months. And I sort of went to other archives at Oxford and Cambridge and Eton College, and went to the basement of the London Library and spent 2 weeks taking pictures of old issues of the Illustrated London News to sort of get a sense of the sweep of their life. Until finally, in the beginning of the summer of 2018, I got an email from the head of the Royal Archives and said, "You're in." And I couldn't believe it.
Okay, having been on the end like you, making pitches, really trying, is there a line that you could tell us? Felt like was the convincing line?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew what line in there flipped the switch. But anyway, I said, "Oh, good, I'll be there next week." And he said, no, you have to put together, if those of you, you're probably librarians in this group, but you know, libraries, particularly research libraries, archives work, you have to work with finding aids to guide you to the material that you want. Guess what? The Royal Archives has no finding aids. So I spent 4 months putting together a finding aid, which I had pulled from the endnotes of other books that had been written. You can only use the Royal Archives to write about somebody who's dead. And so there was William Shawcross's book. There was a book that was written by the official biography of George VI back in the 1950s. And so I presented that to them, and they said, "Whoa," because it was very long and very detailed. And they said, "Okay." And then I started in the fall of 2018, and I spent 3 months there on and off, and it was, well, I describe it in the book, but the way you get to the Royal Archives, I would have to take a train every morning from London, and then I would climb up the hill to Windsor Castle, which all of you who watched the various funerals could see that hill. I'd go through the King Edward VIII gate, and I'd walk up another hill. And then I would go to an unmarked door where I would be buzzed in. And I actually took an illegal picture of this. But what I saw was this very steep staircase of 100 medieval stone steps that I had to climb with my backpack containing a few files and my laptop every day. And it was sort of a riot on the first day. The archivists were all standing at the top of the steps, and I was just, panting, and they sort of chuckled, and they said, "Come on in." And then there was another little staircase of 21, a circular staircase of 21 more steps. And needless to say, I did not go down and have a leisurely lunch. I stayed every day, and I would go and literally bring a sandwich, eat it for 5 minutes, and go back into the research room, which was very small, very efficient, with a table in the middle, with electrical outlets. Thank God we could use our laptops. We couldn't photograph anything, but they were wonderfully accommodating, and it was an incredible thrill to be looking at, like these little diary that Elizabeth started 2 days before the third proposal. She knew that she was going to get this proposal, and she knew she wanted to keep a record of it. But she took 12 days before she said yes. So the whole first chapter is a chronicle of those 12 days.
Including Queen Mary's sort of consternation with her husband as to her poor son wasn't getting an answer.
I know. Well, Queen Mary was always hovering in the background. There was a little village that was trying to propel this engagement along. But yeah, she she never really explained why she took so long, 30 months and then 12 more days, except one of her relatives said, and this makes sense, she came from a very tightly knit, aristocratic, I mean, they were very high. Their father was the 14th Earl of Strathmore, and they had a big castle in Scotland and a big estate in England, and they knew what the royal family was like. And they'd been invited to a state ball, and she had been presented to the king and queen in Scotland, so she knew what she was going to get into. And so this relative of hers who I spoke to said she just didn't think she wanted a public life, because she knew the minute she went into the royal family, it would be a life of total dedication and duty.
And what's really remarkable, and for those of you who have not yet read this book, is, I know all of us have been held captive by those great English dramas, the PBS Masterpiece Theaters. This is like Masterpiece Theater in print, and it's real life. And it really is enthralling, because you do, and this is where I think it's such a gift as a historian, a gift as a writer, because you take that leap from the history and the archives and these letters, and then you stitch together a story that reads like the great, works of fiction or the great Masterpiece Theaters that we are all captive and enthralled by. And you discover through your piecing together, and really reading those letters was sort of extraordinary, and following the path through their entire life of the written communication. Yeah. But I think what you find then through Elizabeth, that she really proved to be the mainstay, his champion, advocate, guide, confidant, great love. She was, as you said, the one that was responsible for finding in the king's speech, the great speech therapist. So how do you see, he might have married someone else. How do you see the choice that he chose Elizabeth as being such a pivot point as well?
Yeah, I mean, he did fall in love with her the minute he danced with her in July 1920, and that began the quest. Elizabeth turned him down the first time, her mother wrote a letter to her friend Mabel Airlie, and she said, he's going to be made or broken by the woman he marries. And she was very disappointed that it wasn't going to be Elizabeth, at least at that stage. And her strength and her fortitude and her determination to defend him at all costs was really important, as was the intricacy of their partnership, which I had never really understood before. She was his complete confidant. And I'm talking about during World War II. I mean, she never explicitly said it, except to say, years later, he told me everything. Churchill knew that he told her everything. And she and her husband and Churchill had a really tight bond. I mean, but you could see the partnership beginning even before the war, during the Munich negotiations, when Neville Chamberlain was traveling back and forth to Munich to try and figure out what to do about Czechoslovakia. And Elizabeth was up in Scotland. The king was down in London, and he sent her all these letters and memoranda for her to look at. Now, that had never happened before, and she would give her feedback. So and that went on during the war.
It was such a modern, it was really in so many ways a very modern marriage.
Very
because
modern.
It was such a full partnership.
Yeah.
And as you say, sort of a calm laid over this nation with their union and with his ascension to king. And then Britain declared war on Germany, September 3rd, 1939. And I felt like that war, through how you painted this, the war was really a chrysalis through which their bond was cemented, and the power of their union was a powerful pull for this wounded nation.
Absolutely.
And so explain how important they ended up being to the British.
I mean, obviously Churchill and his speeches, we've all heard those speeches, incredibly eloquent and inspiring, but they did different things. I mean, first of all, Buckingham Palace was bombed 9 times. The first explosion occurred on the 10th of September, very shortly after the war began. And it happened in the middle of the night. And they came the next day, and it was the first day that they had their luncheon, their weekly luncheon with Churchill. And there's a picture in the book of them inspecting. And you know what they did? They just went out that afternoon, and they went to the East End, the poorest part of London, and they visited the people. And then 3 days later, they were in Buckingham Palace. They had to move because his study had been completely destroyed. So they were facing the quadrangle in the middle of the palace. And an airplane came over and dropped a bunch of bombs. They didn't have time to get to the air raid shelter, but miraculously they escaped. They got into an inner corridor before the damage could be done. People knew the palace had been bombed, but they didn't know that the king and queen had nearly been killed. It was only after World War II, when Churchill was writing his memoirs, and he didn't even know at the time, when they told him what happened. And he said if the windows had been closed instead of open as they were that day, all of the glass would have shattered into the faces and bodies of the king and queen, and they would either have been grievously wounded or killed. So it was that close.
And what you paint through all of the pages of war is sort of extraordinary in its scope. One, because they did not leave. They did not leave for their safety. Instead, every day they made sure they traveled.
They did.
To these war-torn areas where buildings had been blown up and people had lost loved ones and their homes. And they walked amidst the rubble, proclaiming to a nation, we are here.
Yeah, I mean, they did. I mean, that afternoon that they were bombed, they went out. And I mean, this is my 8th biography, and it's really the only one where I've sort of come to tears at various intervals, because they went out after the bombing of Buckingham Palace into the East End, and people started singing to them and thanking them for being there. There was a little hiccup slightly earlier when there had been some booze, and that was I found in another diary, but he, after they had nearly died, he gave a broadcast, and he said, we have personally faced German barbarity, and this is going to impel us all to final victory. And they did make radio broadcasts like that really helped the people understand that they were going through what the people were going through. And it created a real bond that made a huge difference.
Yeah.
One thing that she did that I loved, she scoured all the warehouses that belonged to the royal family, and she put together 60 suites of furniture to put in homeless shelters.
And she also
one example.
And she also, again, as a modern example, she also did radio broadcasts. Elizabeth herself, as well as Lilibet and her sister, they also did radio broadcasts.
Yeah.
So they really used their voices to unify a nation.
And to inspire and to exhort.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit, we're watching Ukraine, and it reminds me a little bit because you see bravery. You see bravery in the midst of extraordinary devastation, and you see patriotism.
Yes.
And I was really caught by, again, you're so detailed, caught by the patriotism, both of the king and queen.
Love of country. Love of country. And this notion of humble service. I mean, reading his diaries, which nobody had done in their entirety since the 1950s, revealed to me he wasn't a great writer, but he was very candid. And for a biographer, there's something incredibly exciting about watching personal growth through the course of something like a diary. And you could see him being a little wobbly at the beginning, but then gaining in confidence. And they really stepped up to greatness. And they, in doing so, they really helped. I mean, imagine the bombardment, there was the 57 days of the Blitz, which pummeled London, but it kept going. And then after D-Day, they had the V-1 and the V-2 rockets, which were completely indiscriminate. And on, I think, the first or second day, obliterated the Guards' Chapel, killing any number of their friends. So he traveled 50,000 miles during World War II. She was with him a lot of the time. They had an armored train. They had armored cars, one of which was called the Brontosaurus. He learned how to shoot a Tommy gun because there was a period of time where they thought it might be invaded. And there's also a famous quote saying, well, why don't you just send the girls to Canada? She said, the girls will not go without me. I will not go without my husband. And my husband will not go. Period.
That, again, it's like that. I think the king he literally found his legs as king and as leader of kind of this monarchy. And it did make me reflect, you and I both have loved ones who have served, your son-in-law in Iraq and Afghanistan, my son is a Marine in Afghanistan, and that kind of service to country, a sense of patriotism. What can you reflect on that, even looking at today?
Well, interestingly, today was the Trooping the Color parade in London. And I was remembering back to the last one that George VI did in 1950, and he was really starting to get sick, and he had to sit down in a chair and watch it. But today was the first one for the new king. And he was accompanied, it was very poignant, he was accompanied by his sister Anne, his son William, and his brother Edward for the first time. Now he's Duke of Edinburgh. And one realizes in seeing something like that, the tight bond there is between the monarch, who is the commander-in-chief, and all these regiments. Not only those who serve out on active duty, but who are doing all sorts of things around Britain and around the world, and their families. And they do an awful lot, as did George VI and Elizabeth, for the military and their families, because that is very much a part of their identity.
Well, it's also part of their identity. It really is service founded in faith.
Yes,
and it,
very
as
much
you mentioned,
in faith.
It's sacramental oil. The king, this current king, it's oil from Jerusalem.
Right.
And I was really struck when they were talking about they felt like they are God's representative on earth.
Yeah.
And their deep faith and their sense that God anointed them to be deeply informed Queen Elizabeth, the queen who just died, but very much informed Queen Elizabeth because she took those vows of God and literally lived them unto death.
Yes, she did. And there were always people who were asking me along the way, why doesn't she abdicate? Why doesn't she just hand it over? And she made a vow, and he has as well. She famously, when she turned 21, and they were in South Africa, she gave that famous speech that you probably saw. It was repeated after her death, that she pledged, my life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. And she reiterated that even as recently as the day that she marked her Platinum Jubilee on the day of her father's death, which was the 6th of February.
Well, she did. She stood sentry her entire life in service to her country.
Yeah.
But I did have one when you also talked about 4 people whose lives form one spiritual whole, which was this original family. And I did want to ask this question because I would say her failure might be she did not form that with her children.
Yes.
Elizabeth did not
Fair
form
comment.
that.
Fair comment. And I don't think it was any lack of love. She was 25 years old when she became queen. She was surrounded by what Diana later called the gray men. And these were a formidable group of men who had advised her father, who were much older. And she was something quite unique among her contemporaries. She was a working mother, and she had to prove herself. I mean, I interviewed Winston Churchill's daughter, Mary Soames, when I was working on my book about the Queen, and she said that she spoke to him not long after Elizabeth became Queen, and he said he was so impressed by how conscientious he was and how she applied herself to everything and paid attention to everything. And I think she was very committed to doing that duty. And as a consequence, she gave her husband the role, not a maternal role, but sort of making the decisions about the family. She was a pretty, not introspective. I mean, she wasn't an introvert because she had to be an extrovert, but she was not a particularly tactile person, not a hugger, the way her mother was a big hugger. And at least Prince Charles had his grandmother, to whom he was extremely close, and to whom he gave a tearful and really moving tribute when she died in 2002. So he had her, he had his nanny, Mabel Anderson, who was the nanny for all of them, but was particularly close to him. She's still alive. She's 97. She lives in Windsor Great Park. Charles gave, the Queen gave her a house. Charles had it all decorated for her. And, they all go to see her. They used to bring her up to Balmoral. So it wasn't a lack of love, but he didn't have maternal love, which I think was an important thing, that they didn't realize that had a consequence.
I mean, every maternal love is the most profound bond there is.
And she left. She had her coronation in 1953, and he was 4. And then they left for 6 months.
Right. So one could wonder, because there are fractures that happen in a child whose mother is absent. And the mother was absent much as, of course, there were layers of love and care.
She was absent a lot.
So we know the tumult of Harry and Meghan, and we know the brothers. And does the monarchy continue?
I think it does. Seeing those scenes today, I think that I don't know how long Charles and Camilla are going to be, how long he's going to be on the throne. She's turning 76 next month, and he's turning 75 in November. Now, he is very fit, and I think she's reasonably fit, but I think she needs more downtime, more relaxation. But they are, by definition, transitional figures by dint of their age. But they've done a very good job training William and Kate. And I think there was a moment when the Queen had a photograph taken of herself with Charles and William and little George when he was very small. He had to stand on a bunch of books to be tall enough to be in the picture. But that knowledge that the line is intact. Now, Harry was always going to be a spare, and he was always going to go further down the line of succession. That's just the way the British monarchy works. But I think there is an inherent strength. Charles will never be as popular as his mother, and Camilla will probably not be that popular because there is some baggage there. And a lot of people have forgiven her and understand, as did the Queen, that she makes Charles happy. They can laugh together. She can support him. And that is very important. Now, I don't know if she's the kind of confidant that Elizabeth was to George VI, but I suspect she may well be.
Because I do have one of the constructs, because there's a lot of controversy. There are a lot of people in England who are very anti-monarchy. It's having been in London, well, I was there for the Queen's funeral, actually, but having been in London with the trooping, the color, the majesty, but you're also blown away by 21st century.
Yeah.
My goodness, the horses, the uniforms, like the massive expense
Yeah.
of keeping a monarchy up. But what do they bring in? Do you have any idea of what? Because then the argument is made for tourism.
Yeah, I mean, they do bring, and having an active monarchy, I mean, Charles isn't living in Buckingham Palace right now because it's going through a massive renovation. I mean, pieces of cornice, one piece of cornice nearly hit Princess Anne on the head once, not long ago, and so they need to do that. But I do think that having a visible monarchy and I think it's important to, I mean, the number of Republicans who want a president is about 20%. Maybe it's even a little more now. But I think if people focus on one phrase that I really love, which is a philosopher now who died last year named Roger Scruton, called the monarch the light above politics. And if you have a president in there instead of a monarch, you immediately create division. And the monarch is intended to unify, to be there as her Lord Chamberlain, David Airlie, who's also amazing. He's 97, knew her since age 5. He said, the sheet anchor we hang on to in times of trouble. And that's not to be dismissed.
It's actually inspiring. That's actually an inspiring, given that we're in a country rife with division and political strife.
I mean,
there's something inspiring about that idea.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just, really, really appreciate that when they start thinking, President David Cameron, President Gordon Brown, do we really want that?
Right. So there's a question probably a lot of people wonder. So a lot of us have watched The Crown.
Oh,
we say, gosh, are we watching history? Like, is this real life? Is The Crown real life?
No. I would say The Crown is, I don't know, it is so heavily fictionalized that every time, I'm dreading November when the final season arrives because I know I'm going to be throwing my pillow at the television over and over and again and saying that didn't happen. I think they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble if they had just put something at the very beginning saying, this is a work of fiction based on some real events. Not even all of the events or all the people by any means are real. But I think just think about it as Downton Abbey with a few more recognizable people. And that you can put your head in a place that can process it a little better.
Yeah. So we have time for just a few questions. I see first back there. Sorry, way back. Wait, can you wait 1 second? We'll get a mic to you.
Thank you. My question has to do with your research. I'm fascinated by how people research history, because I really haven't done much of it. I'm a math science person. But it seems to me it's very similar in that did you find that you had this wonderful idea and it turned into a dead end? And then you step back and said, oh, I should have gone over here. This is where I got the information I needed.
No, it just all sort of flowed.
Wow.
I always felt when I was in that research room that I was just sort of walking along with them. It felt incredibly intimate. And then as I was, going over it in my notes and figuring out how to put it together in a narrative, they just were so alive to me. Another important thing I'll just say quickly is it's really important to go to the places. I visited York Cottage where George V lived for 33 years and George VI was born. And you would not believe how small it is. Queen Alexandra, George V's mother, was so selfish. She stayed in the big house at Sandringham, which had 385 rooms, and it was just Alexandra and a couple of her old friends and relatives. And meanwhile, this whole family of 5 was squashed into this normal-looking house. there's one other thing I really want to do. This is kind of crazy, but you think of these people as being, a little stiff, a little puritanical, and in their letters, particularly after Bertie and Elizabeth became engaged, there was this sort of outpouring of affection. And I'm just going to read you, I scribbled them down earlier today, this exchange of letters from the fall of 1924. They'd been married a little over a year. And she wrote to him, she wrote to him, he was a Balmoral, she was staying with her parents. She said, "I miss you dreadfully and am longing for Monday, when I hope you will arrive here sunburnt, manly, and bronzed, bearing in your arms a haunch of Veneton rôti as an offering to your spouse," to which he wrote, "My very, very loving Elizabeth, many X's and O's. I am going to have 2 lunches. I hope, my darling, in XXXXXXXX, etc., and then an ordinary culinary one."
And with that, so ends our amazingly beautiful love story of King George VI and Elizabeth, thanks to the incredible skill, artistry of historian Sally Bedell Smith, who really wove an extraordinary story across time. So Sally Bedell Smith, we thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.